Sometimes angels come disguised as children, carrying hope in their small hands. The Texas panhandle stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun in 1934, where the Harrison farmhouse stood like a weathered monument to broken dreams. Inside, 38-year-old Mela Harrison knelt beside her kitchen cabinet, her calloused fingers searching desperately through empty mason jars and bare shelves, while her 7-year-old daughter Stella's weak voice echoed through the suffocating heat. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Mela had been a schoolteacher before the drought claimed everything. Her husband to a farming accident, their crops to the relentless dust, and now their hope to starvation. She was a woman who once believed in solutions for every problem, but the Great Depression had taught her that some problems have no earthly answers. As she opened the last empty tin, her heart shattered at her daughter's pleading eyes. That's when the impossible happened. A small knock echoed from their front door, and there stood 8-year-old Melvin, a boy who shouldn't exist, carrying food they couldn't afford, speaking words too wise for his years. His simple response to Stella's hunger would change everything Mela believed about the thin veil between worlds. But who was this mysterious little cowboy? And why did his presence feel like both a blessing and an impossible riddle wrapped in childhood innocence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust had settled into everything. The floorboards, the windowsills, even the creases of Stella's pale face as she lay curled on the faded quilt that had once belonged to Mela's grandmother. 3 days had passed since their last proper meal, and the girl's energy had dwindled to whispered complaints and fitful sleep. Mela pressed her back against the kitchen cabinet, sliding down until she sat on the gritty floor. The wood felt rough through her worn cotton dress, a reminder of how everything in their world had turned harsh and unforgiving. She stared at the empty tin in her hands, the last of their peaches, consumed yesterday when Stella had cried so desperately that Mela couldn't bear it another moment. "Think, Mela," she whispered to herself, using the same stern voice she'd once employed with struggling students. "There has to be something." But the rational part of her mind, the part that had helped her survive 38 years on this earth, knew better. The neighbors were struggling just as badly. The Hendersons had already lost their farm to the bank. Old Mrs. Patterson had started eating dandelion soup just to fill her stomach with something warm. Even the church pantry had run dry weeks ago, Father Miguel apologizing with tears in his eyes as he turned away desperate families. The heat pressed against the windows like a living thing, making the glass shimmer and warp. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the familiar sound of loose soil scraping against the house. Another dust storm was building on the horizon. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath. Stella stirred on the quilt, her small hand reaching toward nothing. "Mama?" "I'm here, baby." Mela crawled across the floor to her daughter, smoothing the damp hair from her forehead. The girl's skin felt too warm, too fragile, like paper that might tear at the slightest touch. "Is Daddy coming back soon?" Stella's voice carried that dreamy quality children got when fever began to set in. "I had a dream he was bringing us groceries." The words hit Mela like a physical blow. Thomas had been gone 8 months now, crushed beneath their overturned tractor when the drought hardened. Earth gave way beneath its wheels. 8 months, and Stella still asked for him in her moments of deepest need. "Daddy's watching over us," Mela managed, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. She'd stopped believing in watching angels the day she'd stood beside Thomas's grave, holding Stella's tiny hand, while the preacher spoke empty words about God's plan. Stella's stomach gave a low, rumbling protest that seemed too loud in the quiet house. The sound made Mela's own empty belly clench in sympathy. When had she last eaten? Yesterday morning, maybe. She'd given Stella the larger portion of their meager breakfast and told herself she wasn't hungry. "Mummy, I'm so hungry it hurts," Stella whimpered, drawing her knees up to her chest. Mela felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, which had been cracked and mended so many times it barely resembled its original shape, but something deeper. Her spirit, perhaps, the last stubborn piece of her that had refused to give up hope. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over their barren fields. The corn that should have been shoulder-high by now existed only as withered stalks, like skeletal fingers reaching toward a sky that had forgotten how to rain. Their vegetable garden had become a plot of cracked earth, decorated with the mummified remains of tomato plants. Thomas used to say that teaching was just another kind of farming. You planted seeds of knowledge and watched them grow. But what happened when the ground itself turned against you? What happened when no amount of nurturing could coax life from dead soil? A movement in the distance caught her eye. At first, she thought it might be another mirage, the kind that had been taunting desperate travelers all summer, but as she pressed her face closer to the glass, she could make out a small figure walking along the dusty road that led to their property. A child, she realized, walking alone in this heat, which struck her as both dangerous and impossible. No parent in their right mind would let a young one wander during the worst part of the day, when the sun could kill a grown man if he wasn't careful. The figure drew closer, and Mela could see it was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. He wore what looked like miniature cowboy clothes, boots, hat, even a small vest. In his hands he carried something that made Mela's heart skip, a bundle wrapped in clean cloth. She rubbed her eyes, certain the heat was playing tricks on her vision. But when she looked again, the boy was still there, now turning up their front path with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where he was going. That's when the knock came. 3 soft raps against their weathered door, as polite and precise as any grown visitor. Mela froze at the window, her hand pressed against the sun-warmed glass. The knocking came again, patient, unhurried, as if the boy had all the time in the world despite the merciless heat that shimmered off the ground in waves. She glanced back at Stella, who had drifted into another restless sleep, her small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The child hadn't stirred at the sound, too weakened by hunger to fully wake. That worried Mela more than anything. Stella had always been such a light sleeper, jumping up at every creak of the old house or rustle of wind through the broken shutters. Moving carefully across the warped floorboards, Mela made her way to the front door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her dress hung loose from too many missed meals, stained with dust and sweat. Her hair, once her pride, hung in limp strands around her face. When was the last time she'd looked in a mirror? When was the last time it had mattered? Before Thomas died, their days had held structure, purpose. She'd rise at dawn to start breakfast while he fed their few remaining chickens. Stella would tumble out of bed, hair wild with sleep, chattering about her dreams or the games she planned to play. They'd sit together at the kitchen table, the same table where Mela had graded papers during her teaching years, and Thomas would read aloud from yesterday's newspaper while Stella drew pictures on scraps of paper. Those mornings felt like someone else's life now. The knock came a third time, still gentle but somehow more insistent. Mela opened the door, squinting against the blast of heat and brightness. The boy stood on their sagging porch, and up close he looked even more peculiar than he had from a distance. His clothes were indeed those of a miniature cowboy, leather chaps over dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a hat that looked expensive, the kind Thomas had always admired in shop windows but never bought. The boy's boots were polished to a shine that seemed impossible given the dusty road he'd just walked. But it was his eyes that made Mela step back involuntarily. They were the kind of blue that reminded her of deep water, startling in their intensity, and they held an unsettling gravity that belonged on the face of someone much older. "Ma'am," the boy said, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I heard someone might be hungry here." His voice carried a slight drawl, the kind Mela remembered from her own grandfather, who'd come to Texas from somewhere deeper south. But beneath the childish timbre was something else, a weight that made the simple words feel significant. "I'm sorry, child, but who are you?" Mela asked, stepping onto the porch and pulling the door partially closed behind her. She didn't want Stella to wake and see their visitor, not when she couldn't explain who he was or where he'd come from. "Are you lost? Do your parents know where you are?" The boy smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a young child with gap-toothed grin and sun-freckled cheeks. "Name's Melvin, ma'am, and I'm exactly where I need to be." He held up the bundle he'd been carrying, and Mela caught the unmistakable scent of fresh bread. Her stomach responded with such violence that she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. When had she last smelled anything so wonderful? The aroma seemed impossible, as if it belonged to a different world entirely, one where ovens still had fuel and flour wasn't more precious than gold. "I can't accept charity," she heard herself say, though every fiber of her being screamed in protest. Pride was a luxury she could barely afford, but it was one of the few things she had left. "We're managing just fine." Melvin's knowing look suggested he could see right through her lie. He glanced past her toward the darkened interior of the house, and for just a moment his expression softened with something that looked remarkably like compassion. "Doesn't seem much like charity when someone's got plenty to share," he said easily. "Besides, my mama always said food tastes better when it's shared with friends." The casual mention of his mother sparked Mela's protective instincts. "Where is your mother, Melvin? She must be worried sick about you being out in this heat." But even as she asked the question, she realized she was stalling. The bread smelled like heaven, and behind the closed door Stella whimpered softly in her sleep, the sound of a child whose small body was consuming itself for sustenance. Melvin didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he unwrapped a corner of the cloth bundle, revealing golden brown crust that looked as perfect as anything from her memories of better times. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "help comes from the most unexpected places. The trick is knowing when to accept it." The words felt like an echo of something Thomas might have said, back when he still believed that things had a way of working themselves out. The words hung in the dusty air between them, and Mela felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the iron grip she'd kept on her composure for so many months. She stared at the boy's earnest face, at the impossible bread in his small hands, and suddenly the world tilted sideways. "Who are you really?" she whispered. And this time the question carried weight beyond mere curiosity. There was something wrong about this entire encounter, something that made her skin prickle with more than just heat. No child walked alone in this wasteland. No family had food to spare, and certainly no 8-year-old spoke with the quiet authority she heard in Melvin's voice. Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the afternoon stillness, the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Mela turned to see Sheriff Coleman's dusty truck lurching down their road, trailing a plume of red dirt. Her heart sank. The sheriff only made house calls for 2 reasons, death or debt. Given that she'd missed her last 3 payments to the bank, she suspected which category brought him here today. "Seems you've got company coming," Melvin observed mildly, following her gaze. "Might want to take this inside before he arrives." He pressed the bundle into her hands before she could protest further. The bread felt warm, impossibly fresh, and beneath the cloth she could feel the outline of other things. What might have been apples, or perhaps small jars. Real food, enough to keep Stella alive for days, maybe even a week. The truck door slammed shut with metallic finality, and Sheriff Coleman emerged like a harbinger of all her worst fears. He'd removed his hat, which meant serious business. In his other hand, he carried a manila envelope that looked thick with official papers. "Ma'am," Melvin said softly, and when she looked down, his strange blue eyes held something that might have been sympathy. "Sometimes a person has to choose between pride and survival. Ain't no shame in choosing what keeps the ones you love alive." Before she could respond, he stepped backward off the porch with surprising grace for such a small child. But instead of heading toward the road where Sheriff Coleman was approaching, he walked around the side of the house, toward the old barn where Thomas used to keep their farming equipment. "Wait!" Mela called after him, but Melvin had already disappeared from view, leaving only the scent of fresh bread and the echo of his words. "Mrs. Harrison," Sheriff Coleman's voice cut through her confusion. He'd reached the porch, hat in hand, his weathered face creased with reluctance. She'd known Bill Coleman for 15 years, had taught his eldest daughter before Stella was born. The fact that he couldn't meet her eyes told her everything she needed to know. "Sheriff," she managed, clutching the bundle against her chest. "What brings you out in this heat?" "You know why I'm here, Mela." He used her first name, which somehow made everything worse. "The bank sent these papers. I'm sorry, but I have to serve them official-like." Inside the house, Stella began to cry, not the sharp wail of injury or fear, but the weak, persistent whimpering of a child too hungry to sleep soundly. The sound cut through both adults like a knife, and Sheriff Coleman's expression crumpled with visible pain. "How long do we have?" Mela asked quietly. 2 weeks to bring the payments current, or—" He gestured helplessly at the envelope. "I'm truly sorry, Mela. If there was anything I could do—" "There isn't," she said, more harshly than she'd intended. 2 weeks. Where was she supposed to find 3 months' worth of mortgage payments in 2 weeks? She might as well have asked to lasso the moon. The sheriff handed her the envelope, and she accepted it with numb fingers. The papers felt heavy, official, final. She thought of Thomas, of how he'd signed their names to the original mortgage with such hope, such certainty that the land would provide for them. He'd never imagined dust storms that lasted for years, crops that withered before they sprouted, or widows left to face impossible choices alone. "Mela," Sheriff Coleman said gently, "there are places in town, organizations that help families in difficult situations. You don't have to—" "I know," she interrupted, though the words came out strangled. She'd seen those places, seen the hollow-eyed families lined up for handouts, their children clinging to their mothers' skirts with the particular stillness that came from chronic hunger. She'd told herself she'd never let Stella become one of those children. But as another weak cry drifted through the door, Mela realized she'd run out of choices that felt like choices. "Sometimes a person has to choose between pride and survival," Melvin had said. The bread in her arms seemed to pulse with warmth, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Sheriff Coleman climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving Mela alone on the porch with her impossible decision and her mysterious gift. The dust from Sheriff Coleman's truck settled slowly in the still air, coating everything with another layer of grit. Mela stood frozen on the porch, the bundle of bread growing heavier in her arms with each passing moment, the eviction papers clutched in her other hand like a death sentence. 2 weeks. The words echoed in her mind with the finality of church bells. 2 weeks to find money that didn't exist, to save a farm that was already dying, to keep a home that felt more like a tomb with each passing day. She looked down at the bundle Melvin had pressed into her hands. The cloth was clean, impossibly clean, white cotton that should have been grey with dust after minutes in this air. Through the fabric she could smell yeast and honey, the warm promise of sustenance. Her mouth watered so violently it made her dizzy. But accepting charity meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat meant acknowledging that everything Thomas had worked for, everything they'd built together, had been for nothing. It meant becoming one of those families she'd pitied from a safe distance, the ones who shuffled through town with their eyes downcast and their children silent with shame. "Mama?" Stella's weak voice drifted through the door, followed by the sound of small bare feet on wooden floors. "Who was that man?" Mela quickly stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind her. She couldn't let Stella see the eviction papers, couldn't burden her daughter with the knowledge that they were about to lose even this meager shelter. 7-year-olds shouldn't have to carry such weight. "Just Sheriff Coleman checking on us," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She slipped the manila envelope behind the old coat rack, out of Stella's line of sight. Stella emerged from the sitting room like a ghost, her nightgown hanging loose on her shrinking frame. Her legs looked like twigs beneath the faded cotton, and her eyes seemed enormous in her gaunt face. When had her daughter become so fragile? The change had been gradual, like watching a flower wilt petal by petal, until suddenly there was barely anything left. "Mama, what's that smell?" Stella's nose twitched, and for the first time in days something like life flickered in her expression. Mella's heart clenched. The bread's aroma filled their small front room, rich and impossible, making the walls seem to close in around her indecision. She could end Stella's suffering right now, could watch her daughter's face light up with joy as she tasted real food for the first time in days. All she had to do was unwrap the bundle. But where had it come from? Who was this strange boy who dressed like a cowboy from another era and spoke with the wisdom of someone 3 times his age? She'd lived in Bitter Creek her entire life, knew every family within 20 miles, and no one had a son named Melvin. No one had food to spare either, yet this child had appeared with fresh bread as if summoned by their desperation. "It smells like Mrs. Patterson's kitchen used to smell," Stella whispered, moving closer, "before everything got bad." The innocent observation hit Mella like a physical blow. Before everything got bad, as if their current nightmare was just a temporary inconvenience, something that would eventually pass like a spring storm. But children lived in a world where parents fixed everything, where mothers were supposed to have answers and solutions. Stella still believed in happy endings. Mella knelt down, bringing herself to her daughter's eye level. Up close, she could see the dark circles under Stella's eyes, the way her lips had begun to crack from dehydration. They were running out of time, not just to save the farm, but to save themselves. "Stella, baby, if someone offered to help us, but we didn't know them very well, what do you think we should do?" Stella considered this with the seriousness she brought to all of her mother's questions. Daddy used to say that most folks are good folks, and sometimes angels come disguised as strangers. Angels. Mela almost laughed at the bitter irony. If God sent angels, where had they been when Thomas died? Where had they been during the endless months of drought and desperation? Where had they been last night when she'd lain awake calculating how many more days they could survive on empty stomachs and hope? But looking at her daughter's expectant face, Mela felt her resolve wavering. What if she was wrong? What if pride was just another word for stubbornness, and stubbornness was a luxury she couldn't afford? What if accepting help from a mysterious child was the difference between Stella living and dying? Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose shutters and sending another wave of dust against the windows. The sound reminded her of how isolated they were, how far from help, how completely alone in their struggle. In 2 weeks, they wouldn't even have these thin walls to protect them from the elements. The bundle seemed to grow warmer in her hands, as if responding to her internal battle. Somewhere in the distance she thought she heard the sound of whistling, a child's melody, carefree and bright, fading away like a half-remembered dream. Mela stood in the center of her failing home, the bundle of bread warm against her chest, listening to the fading whistle drift away on the dusty wind. The sound stirred something deep in her memory, a melody Thomas used to hum while working in the fields, back when the earth still promised abundance instead of heartbreak. 2 weeks. The eviction papers hidden behind the coat rack might as well have been written in fire for how they burned in her consciousness. She could pretend they didn't exist, could continue rationing the last of their flour and water, until Stella grew too weak to cry for food. She could maintain her pride right up until they were sleeping under the stars with nothing but dignity to keep them warm. Or she could cross a line she'd sworn never to cross. "Mama?" Stella's voice had grown thinner, more fragile, like something that might blow away in the next dust storm. "Can we see what's in the cloth?" The simple request shattered the last of Mela's resistance. She sank down onto the sitting room floor, her legs no longer able to support the weight of her decision. With trembling fingers, she began to unwrap the bundle, each fold of clean white cotton revealing treasures that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Fresh bread, golden and perfect, still warm as if it had just emerged from an oven. 2 red apples that gleamed like jewels, their skin unmarked by dust or drought. A small jar of what looked like honey, amber bright and clear, and beneath it all, wrapped in brown paper, slices of ham that filled the air with rich, smoky fragrance. Stella gasped, a sound of pure wonder that Mela hadn't heard from her daughter in months. "Is it real, Mama? Is it really real?" Instead of answering, Mela tore off a piece of the bread. It was soft, yielding, everything their stale scraps had not been. She handed it to Stella and watched her daughter's face transform as she bit into it, watched color flood back into her pale cheeks, watched her eyes brighten with something beyond mere hunger satisfaction. This was what surrender felt like, not the crushing defeat she'd imagined, but a strange lightness, as if a weight she'd been carrying for months had suddenly lifted from her shoulders. She was accepting charity from a mysterious child who might not even be real, feeding her daughter bread that had appeared like magic in a land where nothing grew. And she didn't care. "It tastes like heaven," Stella whispered around another bite, and Mela felt tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spill over. She pulled Stella onto her lap, both of them sitting on the warped floorboards of their dying home, sharing impossible food that tasted like hope. For the first time since Thomas's death, Mela allowed herself to imagine that tomorrow might be different from today. Not easier, necessarily, but different. Possible. "Mama, who was that boy?" Stella asked between bites of apple, juice running down her chin. "The one in the cowboy clothes?" Mela paused, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. "You saw him?" "From the window. He looked like the cowboys in my picture books, but smaller." Stella's eyes grew thoughtful. "He waved at me before he went away. Do you think he'll come back?" Something cold moved through Mela's chest, despite the warmth of the food. She'd been so careful to keep Stella away from the door, so certain her daughter had been asleep. But apparently nothing had escaped those bright, observant eyes. "I don't know, baby," she said honestly. "I don't know anything about him." But even as she spoke the words, Mela realized that not knowing had ceased to matter. She'd crossed her threshold the moment she'd unwrapped that first corner of cloth. There was no going back to the woman who'd rather watch her daughter starve than accept help from strangers. That woman had died here on this floor, replaced by someone who would do whatever it took to keep Stella alive. The eviction papers still waited behind the coat rack, still promised homelessness in 14 days. The drought still stretched endlessly in all directions, and their few remaining neighbors still watched the sky for rain that never came. Nothing about their circumstances had actually changed. But everything had changed. Because Mela Harrison had finally admitted that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, and that sometimes survival meant accepting miracles without questioning their source. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on their failing farm, but for the first time in months, it sounded less like a funeral dirge and more like a song, wild and uncertain, but somehow full of possibility. She pulled Stella closer and reached for another piece of bread, ready to embrace whatever strange journey lay ahead. The bread tasted like redemption, but redemption, Mela soon discovered, came with its own set of complications. The morning after Melvin's visit brought Mrs. Gertrude Haskell to their door, all 65 years of her wrapped in righteous indignation and a faded black dress that had seen better decades. Gertrude served as Bitter Creek's unofficial moral authority, the kind of woman who could smell scandal 3 counties away and considered it her Christian duty to root out impropriety wherever it flourished. "Mela Harrison," she announced without preamble, pushing past the screen door like judgment incarnate. "We need to talk." Stella retreated behind her mother's skirts, clutching the corn-husk doll Thomas had made her last Christmas. The child's instincts about people had always been sharp, and something about Mrs. Haskell's angular presence made the small house feel even smaller. "Mrs. Haskell," Mela managed, frantically trying to remember if she'd left any evidence of yesterday's mysterious feast visible. The empty jar that had held honey now sat innocuously on the kitchen counter, washed clean while the last precious slices of bread remained hidden in the cupboard. "What brings you by? Don't play innocent with me, girl." Gertrude's sharp eyes swept the room, taking inventory. Sheriff Coleman mentioned you had a visitor yesterday. A boy. Said he was bringing you food. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Mela felt her face burn with shame, not for accepting help, but for being caught accepting it. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, privacy was another luxury she couldn't afford. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. "Horse feathers." Gertrude stepped closer, her presence filling the room with the scent of camphor and disapproval. In times like these, decent folks don't have food to spare for charity, so either someone's been holding out on their neighbors or you've been accepting handouts from strangers. Either way, it reflects poorly on this community. Behind her skirts, Stella made a small sound of distress. The child understood more than she should about the delicate social hierarchies that governed their dying town, the unspoken rules that separated the deserving poor from the shameful poor. "My daughter was hungry," Mela said quietly, lifting her chin despite the fire in her cheeks. "If someone offered food, I wasn't going to turn it away." "And where exactly did this mysterious benefactor come from?" "Sheriff Coleman said you claimed it was a boy named Melvin." Gertrude's laugh held no humor. "Child, I've lived in this county for 43 years. I know every family, every child, every dog that's ever drawn breath in these parts. There's no boy named Melvin within 50 miles of here." The statement hit Mela like cold water. She'd suspected as much, had felt the strangeness of Melvin's appearance in her bones, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach clench with unease. Who was the boy who'd saved them? What was the boy who'd saved them? Maybe he was passing through, she suggested weakly. Passing through to where? From where? "In case you hadn't noticed, Mela, we're not exactly on the road to anywhere." Gertrude moved to the window, peering out at the desolate landscape. No family would send a child out alone in this heat, this drought. It's not natural. The word natural seemed to echo in the small room, carrying weight beyond its simple meaning. Mela thought of Melvin's two wise eyes, his clean clothes in a world covered with dust, the impossible freshness of the food he'd brought. Natural? No, nothing about yesterday had been natural. But Stella was alive. This morning her daughter had woken with color in her cheeks and strength in her voice. She'd asked for water, without the desperate edge that had characterized her requests for weeks. Whatever Melvin was, natural or otherwise, he'd given them time. Furthermore, Gertrude continued, turning back to face them, if word gets around that folks are accepting handouts from mysterious strangers, it reflects badly on all of us, makes us look desperate. "We are desperate," Mela said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The admission hung between them like a confession. Gertrude's expression softened slightly, revealing the tired woman beneath the armor of moral certainty. "We're all desperate, child. But desperation doesn't excuse recklessness. If this boy comes back, you need to find out who he is, where he's from, and if you can't get answers." She left the threat unfinished. After Gertrude left, the house felt haunted by more than just the memory of yesterday's miracle. Mela sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cleaned honey jar, wondering if she'd crossed more than just the line between pride and survival. Maybe she'd crossed into something darker, stranger, more dangerous than simple charity. But when Stella laughed, actually laughed, while playing with her doll in the afternoon sunshine streaming through the window, Mela knew she'd make the same choice again. Whatever rules governed this new world she'd entered, whatever tests lay ahead, her daughter's laughter was worth any price. The afternoon stretched long and oppressive after Gertrude's departure. Each hour waited with the promise of approaching storm clouds that never delivered rain. Mela found herself drawn repeatedly to the windows, scanning the horizon not for relief from the drought, but for a small figure in cowboy clothes who might or might not exist in any way she understood. Stella had fallen asleep on the sitting room floor, her doll clutched against her chest, and for the first time in weeks she slept without the restless turning that came from an empty stomach. The sight should have brought Mela comfort, but instead it sharpened her awareness of how precarious their situation remained. One meal, One miraculous, impossible meal had bought them perhaps a day or two, nothing more. The eviction papers still waited behind the coat rack like a death sentence, and tomorrow would bring the same desperate mathematics of survival. She needed a plan, not just for the next meal or the next week, but for the fundamental question of how to keep herself and Stella alive in a world that seemed determined to grind them into dust. The farm was lost. Even if some miracle brought rain tomorrow, they lacked the resources to plant, to harvest, to rebuild what the drought had destroyed. Thomas's tools had been sold months ago, along with anything else of value they'd once possessed. The thought of her dead husband brought a familiar ache, but today it carried an edge of something sharper. Anger, perhaps. Thomas had been a good man, a loving father, but he'd also been stubborn in the way that killed people during hard times. He'd refused to consider leaving the farm, even as the signs of the coming disaster mounted around them. "This land chose us," he'd say, running dirt through his fingers like a prayer. "We don't abandon what chooses us." But the land hadn't chosen them. It had used them, consumed their labor and hope and savings, then discarded them when the rains stopped coming. Now Mela was left to navigate the aftermath of his noble foolishness, and every choice before her seemed to lead deeper into unknown territory. A knock at the door made her heart leap, but when she opened it, she found not Melvin but Samuel Morrison, their nearest neighbor and Thomas's oldest friend. Samuel's gaunt frame filled the doorway, his face carved into new lines by worry and sleepless nights. "Afternoon, Mela," he said, removing his hat. "Wanted to check on you and the little one. Heard you had some excitement yesterday." The speed with which news traveled in their dying community never ceased to amaze her. "Just a visitor, Sam. Nothing to fuss about." But Samuel's expression suggested he'd heard more than the basic facts. "Gertrude came by my place. Said some strange boy brought you food. Said nobody knows where he came from." He paused, studying her face. "Said you might be in some kind of trouble." Mela felt heat rise in her cheeks again. In the old world, before the drought, accepting charity had been shameful. In this new world, accepting charity from unknown sources apparently qualified as dangerous recklessness. She was learning the rules as she broke them. "We're managing, Sam." "Are you?" His voice carried the gentle insistence of someone who'd known her since childhood. "Because if you need help, if you need somewhere to stay." He trailed off, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. Samuel had his own family to worry about, his own shrinking resources. The offer was genuine but desperate. "I appreciate that. I truly do. But we're not ready to give up on this place yet." The lie came easier than she'd expected. She was absolutely ready to give up on the farm. Would have left months ago if she'd had anywhere to go, but admitting that meant accepting that Thomas had died for nothing, that their entire adult life had been built on a foundation of self-deception. After Samuel left, promising to check on them again soon, Mela found herself facing the approaching evening with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Part of her hoped Melvin would return, would solve their immediate crisis with another bundle of impossible food. But a larger part, the part that had been listening too carefully to Gertrude's warnings, feared what his return might mean. She heated the last of their precious water and gave Stella a careful bath, washing away the dust that seemed to settle on everything within minutes of cleaning. Her daughter submitted to the attention with unusual docility, still strengthened by yesterday's feast, but beginning to show the familiar signs of returning hunger. "Mama," Stella said as Mela combed the tangles from her hair, "do you think that boy is lonely?" The question caught her off guard. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" He looked sad when he thought nobody was watching, like he wanted to stay but couldn't. Stella turned to face her mother, eyes wide with 7-year-old certainty. "I think he needs friends." As darkness gathered outside their failing walls, Mela wondered if her daughter had seen something in their mysterious visitor that she herself had missed. Something that might make the approaching test even more complicated than she'd imagined. The test came at 3 in the morning, announced by Stella's screams cutting through the suffocating darkness like shattered glass. Mela jolted awake, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stumbled toward her daughter's cot. Stella thrashed against the thin sheets, her small body burning with fever, her face flushed crimson in the pale moonlight filtering through their cracked window. When Mela pressed her palm to the child's forehead, the heat nearly scorched her skin. "Mama!" Stella's voice came out as a ragged whisper. "It hurts. Everything hurts." Terror, cold and absolute, flooded Mela's veins. She'd seen this before. The sudden onset, the raging fever, the way a child could go from healthy to dying in a matter of hours. In a town without a doctor, 40 miles from the nearest hospital, with no money for medicine and no way to travel, this fever might as well be a death sentence written in fire across her daughter's skin. "Shh, baby, shh," Mela whispered, her voice breaking as she gathered Stella's burning form into her arms. "Mama's here. Mama's going to take care of you." But even as she spoke the words, Mela knew she was lying. She had no medicine, no remedies beyond cool water from their dwindling supply and desperate prayers to a God who seemed to have abandoned this corner of Texas entirely. She could sit here and watch her daughter burn from the inside out, could hold her while the fever consumed everything that made Stella herself, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Yesterday's miracle food had strengthened Stella just enough to make this moment more devastating. For a few precious hours, Mela had allowed herself to hope, had imagined that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this ordeal intact. Now that hope felt like mockery, like some cosmic joke played at the expense of a mother's heart. She carried Stella to the kitchen, her daughter's body limp as a rag doll in her arms. With shaking hands, she dampened a cloth with their precious water and pressed it to Stella's forehead, watching the fabric grow warm within seconds. The fever raged like a furnace, and all Mela could do was tend it with inadequate tools and breaking prayers. "Please," she whispered to the empty air, to whatever force might be listening in the vast indifference of the night. "Please, not her. Take the farm, take everything else, but not her. She's just a baby. She hasn't done anything wrong." Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Mela changed the cloth again and again, each time feeling the heat win another small victory against her efforts. Stella drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying for water, sometimes calling for her father who couldn't answer, sometimes just staring at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to see things that weren't there. As dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon with false promises of hope, Stella's breathing grew shallow and rapid, her lips cracked and white, moved soundlessly, and when Mela leaned close to listen, she heard her daughter whispering words that made her blood turn to ice water. The cowboy boy is coming. He's coming to take me home." "No," Mela said fiercely, gripping Stella's burning hands. "You're staying right here with me. Do you hear me? You're not going anywhere." But even as she spoke, Mela felt something shift in the air around them, a presence that made the hair on her arms stand upright. The temperature in the kitchen dropped several degrees, and she caught the faint scent of something that didn't belong, leather and sage, and something indefinable that reminded her of rain on summer earth. This was the moment Gertrude had warned her about, the price of accepting help from unknown sources. This was what happened when you invited mystery into your life without asking the right questions. Now it had come for the one thing Mela couldn't bear to lose, and she understood with crystalline clarity that everything she'd learned about survival, about pride, about the nature of sacrifice, was about to be tested in ways that would either save her soul or destroy it completely. "Stella," she whispered urgently, shaking her daughter's shoulders gently, "look at me, sweetheart. Stay with Mama. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, you stay right here with me." But Stella's eyes were already fixed on something beyond the kitchen window, something that made her fever-bright face transform with wonder and recognition. Her cracked lips curved into the ghost of a smile, and when she spoke, her voice carried an otherworldly calm that terrified Mela more than any scream. "He's here, Mama. The lonely boy is here." Outside their failing house, footsteps approached across the dust-covered ground, small boots walking with purpose through the pre-dawn darkness, coming to collect what they'd been promised or to offer salvation at a price Mela might not be willing to pay. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and in the silence that followed, Mela could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Stella's fever-bright eyes remained fixed on the window, her breathing so shallow now that Mela had to lean close to feel the whisper of air against her cheek. 3 soft knocks echoed through the pre-dawn stillness. "Don't answer it," Mela whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to herself, to Stella, or to whatever presence waited beyond their threshold. "We don't answer." But Stella's burning hand slipped from her mother's grasp with surprising strength, and the child began to sit up, drawn toward that patient, knocking like iron filings to a magnet. Her eyes never left the window, where a small silhouette now stood visible against the grey morning light. "He's waiting for me, Mama," Stella said, her voice carrying that same otherworldly calm that had terrified Mela moments before. He says it doesn't hurt where he is." "No." The word came out as a sob, and Mela wrapped her arms around her daughter's burning form, trying to anchor her to this world through sheer force of will. "You're not going anywhere. I won't let you." 3 more knocks, gentler this time, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Harrison?" The voice that came through the door was Melvin's, but it carried a weight of sorrow that no 8-year-old should possess. "I know you're frightened. I know you don't understand. But your little girl is hurting and I can help." "Help?" Mela's voice cracked with desperate fury. "You call this help? She was getting better. She was strong yesterday." A long pause. When Melvin spoke again, his words carried the patience of centuries. "The fever isn't because of me, Mom. It's because this world is trying to call her home, and there ain't enough left here to keep her anchored. I can see the threads getting thinner." Mela felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper, some fundamental belief in the basic fairness of existence. Yesterday's miracle had been a lie, or worse than a lie. It had been a preview of loss, a glimpse of what life could be just before it was snatched away forever. "Please," she whispered, rocking Stella against her chest. "Please, I'll give you anything. The farm, my life, anything. Just leave her alone." "I don't want those things," Melvin said softly. "And I'm not here to take her, Mrs. Harrison. I'm here to offer you a choice." In her arms, Stella had grown frighteningly still. Her breathing came in tiny gasps now, and her skin felt like parchment against Mela's hands. Whatever choice Melvin offered, it was coming whether she wanted it or not. "What choice?" she managed. "Let me in, and I'll show you." Every instinct screamed against it. Opening that door meant accepting that this moment was real, that her daughter was dying, that the normal rules of life and death no longer applied to their situation. It meant stepping fully into whatever strange territory she'd entered when she first accepted Melvin's help. But Stella was fading in her arms, slipping away with each labored breath, and all of Mela's fierce maternal protection amounted to nothing against the simple biological fact of fever consuming a small body from within. She carried Stella to the door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch, and for a moment she hesitated, thinking of Gertrude's warnings, of Samuel's concern, of all the normal people living normal lives who would never have to make this choice. Then Stella's breathing hitched, stopped for a terrifying second, and resumed with a rattle that spoke of borrowed time. The door opened. Melvin stood on the threshold in his perfect cowboy clothes, his hat in his hands, and Mela could see now what Stella had recognized, the profound loneliness that lived behind his 2 wise eyes. He looked older somehow in the grey morning light, or perhaps she was finally seeing him clearly for the first time. "Thank you," he said quietly, stepping inside. The scent of leather and sage and distant rain filled the kitchen, pushing back the stale air of sickness and desperation. "What are you?" Mela asked, clutching Stella protectively despite having invited him in. "I'm 8 years old," Melvin said simply. "I've been 8 years old for 53 years now, and I remember being lonely enough to die. I remember wanting someone to come save me, and nobody came." He looked at Stella with infinite gentleness, So when I hear crying, I come. When I see hunger, I feed it. When I find loneliness—" He paused, his eyes meeting Mella's. "Well, sometimes loneliness calls to loneliness, across whatever distance. I don't understand. Your daughter is dying, Mrs. Harrison. The fever will take her within the hour, and there isn't enough medicine or prayer or love in this whole drought-cursed county to stop it." His words hit like physical blows, each one confirming what Mela's heart already knew. "But I can offer her something else. I can offer you both something else." "What?" Melvin reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made Mela's world tilt sideways. A small glass bottle filled with water so clear it seemed to contain light itself. "A way to follow where love leads," he said, "even if it leads past the edges of everything you thought you knew." The bottle caught the grey morning light and fractured it into impossible colours, blues deeper than any sky Mela had ever seen, greens that spoke of meadows that had never known drought, gold like wheat fields in her childhood memories before the world turned to dust. The water within didn't move like ordinary water. It seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, as if it contained not liquid, but captured starlight. "What is it?" Mela whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. "It's what I should have had 53 years ago, when the fever took me in this very house," Melvin said. "It's what every dying child should have, a choice." The words hit Mela like a physical blow. This house. He had died here, in her kitchen, in the same spot where Stella now burned with fever. The realization came with a cascade of other truths that had been hiding in plain sight. The way Melvin knew exactly where everything was, how he moved through their home like someone returning to a familiar place. The strange comfort he seemed to take from these walls, despite their current decay. "You lived here," she breathed. "My parents homesteaded this land in 1881, built this house with their own hands, board by board. I was born in the back bedroom on a night when the wind howled so fierce it nearly took the roof off." His voice carried the weight of decades, memories preserved in amber. "When the fever came for me, they did exactly what you're doing. Held me, prayed for me, watched me slip away piece by piece. But there was no choice then, just ending." Stella stirred in Mela's arms, her eyes fluttering open to focus on the bottle with an intensity that frightened her mother. "It's pretty," the child whispered, her voice barely audible. "It sounds like singing." Mela heard nothing, but she watched her daughter's face transform with wonder, as if Stella could perceive something beyond normal senses. The fever's crimson flush began to fade from the child's cheeks, replaced by an otherworldly pallor that was somehow worse. "The choice," Mela said urgently. "Tell me about the choice." Melvin knelt beside them, bringing himself to Stella's eye level. When he spoke, his words were directed to the dying child, not her mother. "You can stay here and hurt, little one, fight the fever and maybe win, maybe lose, or—" He held up the bottle, and its contents seemed to pulse brighter. "You can come with me to a place where nothing hurts ever again, where there's always enough food, where the dust never settles, where lonely children find each other and play until the stars come out." "That's death," Mela said, her voice hollow. "You're describing death." "Am I?" Melvin's ancient eyes met hers. "Is it death when you can think and feel and love, when you can help other children who cry in the night, when you can visit your mama whenever loneliness calls you home?" He paused. "Or is it just different?" Stella's hand moved with tremendous effort, reaching toward the bottle. "Would you be there? Would you be my friend?" "I would," Melvin promised. "You'd never be alone again." The truth crystallized in Mela's mind with brutal clarity. This wasn't about medicine or miracles or fighting the fever. This was about choosing between two kinds of loss, losing Stella to death, or losing her to something else entirely, something that meant she might return on desperate nights when her mother's grief became too heavy to bear alone. She would still be— Mela couldn't finish the question. "She would still be Stella," Melvin said gently. "Still your little girl, just not bound by the same rules that are trying to break her body right now." In her arms, Stella had grown frighteningly still, but her eyes remained fixed on the bottle with an expression of perfect peace. "Armor," she whispered. "I'm so tired of hurting." The words shattered something fundamental in Mela's chest. All her fierce protection, all her determination to keep Stella anchored to this world, couldn't change the simple fact that staying meant suffering, and leaving might mean something else entirely, something that didn't end with a gravestone and empty arms. "If I let her," Mela's voice broke, "if she chooses, would I see her again? When your own time comes, yes. And maybe before, if the loneliness gets too deep and she can find her way back to comfort you." Mela looked down at her daughter's face, saw the pain flickering behind those fever-bright eyes, and understood that love sometimes meant letting go, not into emptiness, but into mystery. The bottle pulsed with patient light, waiting for a mother's impossible choice and a dying child's brave decision about what came after the edges of everything they thought they knew. The revelation wasn't about death or supernatural visitors or the drought that had claimed their world. It was about love transcending the boundaries of existence itself, and whether some forms of salvation looked nothing like what desperate hearts expected them to be. The bottle hung suspended between worlds, between hope and despair, between letting go and holding on, and Mela found herself caught in that same impossible space. For long moments the kitchen held its breath, while three souls wrestled with choices that had no clean answers. Then something shifted inside her, not breaking but transforming, like metal heated until it could be reshaped into something stronger. The terror remained, but alongside it came a clarity she hadn't possessed since Thomas died, the understanding that love meant more than just clinging to what you feared to lose. "Wait," she said softly, and Melvin's hand stilled. Before any choosing happens, I need to understand." She looked into his ancient eyes. "You've been alone all this time, 53 years of helping other children, other families. But who helps you?" The question seemed to surprise him. His composure flickered, revealing glimpses of the lonely 8-year-old beneath the centuries of purpose. "I don't need—" "Everyone needs," Mela interrupted with sudden fierceness. "Even dead little boys who've forgotten what it feels like to be taken care of." She shifted Stella gently in her arms, her daughter's breathing steadier now in the presence of whatever power emanated from that bottle. "You said loneliness calls to loneliness. Well, I've been plenty lonely since Thomas passed, and if she goes with you, then we'll both need looking after, won't we?" Understanding dawned in Melvin's expression, followed by something that might have been wonder. "You're not just thinking about letting her go, you're thinking about how to keep loving her." "I'm thinking about family," Mela said, and the word felt different in her mouth now, bigger, more flexible than she'd ever imagined. "I'm thinking that maybe family doesn't end with heartbeats and breathing. Maybe it just changes shape." She looked down at Stella, who was watching the exchange with fever-bright eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Baby, can you hear us? Do you understand what we're talking about?" "I understand, Mama." Stella's voice came out as barely a whisper, but it carried absolute certainty. "The boy, Melvin, he's been alone so long he forgot what it's like to have a mama worry about him. And if I go with him, you'll be alone too. Unless—" She paused, her child's mind working through concepts that should have been beyond her years. "Unless we figure out how to still be a family, just differently." Mela felt tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. "That's right, sweetheart. That's exactly right." She looked at Melvin again, seeing him clearly now, not as a supernatural force or a harbinger of death, but as a child who had been carrying an enormous burden for longer than anyone should have to bear it alone. "When you come to help other families, do you ever get to rest? Do you ever get to be 8 years old instead of some kind of guardian angel?" Melvin's careful composure cracked entirely. "I remember wanting someone to tell me stories, to make sure I wasn't scared in the dark. But that's not what I am anymore. I'm what comes when children need help. Maybe you could be both, Mela said gently. Maybe that's what we all need. To be both the helpers and the helped, the strong ones and the ones who sometimes need taking care of. She made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. Melvin, if Stella chooses to go with you, would you both stay close? Would you let me take care of you sometimes? Would you come for supper and stories and all the things that lonely children need? You would do that? His voice cracked with disbelief. Even knowing what I am? Especially knowing what you are. You're a little boy who's been helping everyone else for 50 years. It's past time someone helped you. Stella stirred in her arms, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there moments before. Mama, I think I want to try being different. I want to not hurt anymore, but I don't want to leave you, and I don't want Melvin to be alone. She looked at the bottle with its impossible light. If I drink that, could we all still be together, just not the same way as before? Mela closed her eyes and felt something unprecedented unfold in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something fiercer and more complex. The courage to love beyond the boundaries of what seemed possible. I think, she said slowly, that we're about to find out what family really means. She looked at Melvin, then at Stella, and saw not tragedy but transformation. Not endings, but beginnings that wore unfamiliar shapes. The drought still raged outside, their farm was still failing, and the world remained harsh and unforgiving. But here, in this kitchen, where a lonely boy had died 53 years ago, where her daughter now chose something beyond ordinary survival, Mela discovered that love was more durable than circumstances, more flexible than the rigid rules about life and death she'd always accepted. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" she asked, and Stella nodded with perfect trust. Stella's small hands wrapped around the bottle with surprising steadiness, her fever-weakened fingers gaining strength from contact with the impossible light within. Mela felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't pull away. This was what commitment looked like, staying present for the moment that would change everything, no matter how it terrified her. "Wait," Melvin said softly, his ancient eyes suddenly uncertain. "Mrs. Harrison, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. If you truly mean to take care of me sometimes, to let us be family." He swallowed hard. "It means your life won't ever be normal again. People in town already whisper about you. When they see me coming around, when they notice Stella's different." He paused. "They'll think you've lost your mind." Mela almost laughed at the absurdity of worrying about gossip when her daughter was about to drink liquid starlight and transform into something beyond death. But she saw the genuine concern in Melvin's face and realized he was offering her one last chance to step back from the precipice. "Melvin," she said firmly, "I buried my husband 2 years ago, and I've been watching my daughter slowly starve in a drought that's killed half the county. My farm's failing, my neighbors already think I'm desperate, and yesterday I was ready to lose everything." She touched Stella's burning cheek. "Normal ended a long time ago. This is just choosing what comes next." Stella lifted the bottle closer to her lips, then stopped. "Mama, will it hurt you, watching me change?" The question pierced deeper than any physical pain. Mela wanted to lie, to make this easier for her brave little girl, but she found herself incapable of anything but truth. "Yes, baby, it's going to hurt something fierce, but not as much as losing you completely would hurt, and not as much as watching you suffer in this body that can't get well. And you'll really take care of Melvin, even when he's being mysterious and strange." Despite everything, Mela smiled, especially then. Someone needs to make sure he eats proper meals and doesn't spend every moment helping other people instead of himself. Melvin's expression shifted through wonder, gratitude, and something that might have been fear. "I don't remember how to be taken care of." "Then we'll figure it out together," Mela said. "All 3 of us." Stella nodded with the solemnity of someone making an adult decision in a child's body. She brought the bottle to her lips, paused for one last look at her mother's face, then drank. The change began immediately. Light spread through Stella's small frame, not the harsh glare of fever, but something warm and golden that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her breathing, which had been labored and painful, smoothed into something deeper and more peaceful. The terrible heat that had been consuming her faded, replaced by a coolness that spoke of autumn mornings and clear streams. But it was her eyes that told Mela the transformation was complete. They remained Stella's eyes, bright with intelligence and love, but now they held depths that hadn't been there before, an awareness that stretched beyond the confines of childhood into something vast and knowing. "Mama?" Stella's voice carried new harmonics, as if it echoed from farther away than her physical form suggested. "I'm here, sweetheart. I can see everything. The drought, but also the rain that's coming. The hunger in town, but also the harvest, 3 years from now when the earth remembers how to give again." Stella sat up in her mother's arms with effortless grace. "And I can see you, Mama. How lonely you've been, how scared, but also how strong." She smiled, and it was both entirely familiar and utterly transformed. "You don't have to be alone anymore." Melvin watched the transformation with an expression of profound relief, as if he'd been holding his breath for 53 years and could finally exhale. "Stella, how do you feel?" "Light," she said simply. "Like I could float if I wanted to, but I don't want to because you're both here." She looked between them with new understanding. "We're really going to be a family, aren't we? A strange, impossible family." "The strangest," Mela agreed, pulling both children close and marveling that she could touch them, hold them, even as she understood they existed now in a space between worlds. But the consequences of their choice were already manifesting. Through the kitchen window she could see Samuel's truck approaching, dust trailing behind it like a signal of the ordinary world's intrusion. Soon there would be questions, examinations, demands for explanations that no rational person would accept. "They're coming," Melvin said quietly, following her gaze. "The town, the authorities, they'll want to understand what happened here, and they won't like the answers we'd have to give." Mela stood, still holding Stella, and felt the weight of her decision settle fully upon her shoulders. She had chosen love over logic, mystery over certainty, and now she would have to defend that choice against a world that demanded conventional explanations for unconventional miracles. The final confrontation was no longer approaching, it was here. Samuel's boots thundered across the porch before his knock shattered the kitchen's otherworldly calm. Behind him came other voices, Dr. Matthews, Sheriff Carver, and what sounded like half the town council. The ordinary world had arrived in force, armed with medical bags and legal authority and the absolute certainty that reality followed predictable rules. "Mela, open up!" Samuel's voice carried panic and determination in equal measure. We heard Stella took a turn for the worse. "Doc's here to help." Mela looked at her transformed daughter, who appeared perfectly healthy but radiated an unmistakable otherworldliness that no amount of explanation could rationalize away. Stella's skin held that golden luminescence, subtle but undeniable in the afternoon light. Her eyes carried depths that would unnerve any adult who looked too closely. "What do we tell them?" Mela whispered. Melvin stepped forward, his small face set with grim resolve. "The truth will only bring trouble. They'll want to study her, test her, take her away to understand what she's become." His ancient eyes held 53 years of watching humans react to what they couldn't comprehend. Some miracles are too dangerous to reveal. The knocking intensified. Sheriff Carver's voice joined the chorus. "Mrs. Harrison, we need to see you're both all right. Samuel says the child was dying." Stella touched her mother's face with fingers that felt cool as morning air. "Mama, I can make them see what they need to see. I can appear as I was before, sick but recovering. But it means hiding what I really am now." The weight of the choice pressed down on Mela's shoulders. She had fought so hard for truth, for the courage to accept impossible love, and now that very love demanded deception. Everything she'd learned about letting go, about embracing mystery over certainty, would be tested by her ability to protect her transformed family from a world that would never understand them. "Do it," she said quietly, "but remember, no matter how you look to them, I see who you really are." Stella nodded and closed her eyes. The luminescence faded from her skin, replaced by the pale exhaustion of a child recovering from fever. The otherworldly depths in her gaze dimmed to simple human weariness. When she opened her eyes again, she looked like any 7-year-old who'd been desperately ill, but was finally turning the corner toward health. Only Melvin remained fully visible, and Mela realized with growing panic that 8-year-old boys didn't simply materialize in isolated farmhouses without explanations. "The cellar," she said urgently. "Melvin, you need to—" "No." His voice carried quiet steel. "I've hidden for 53 years, Mela. If we're going to be family, if you're going to take care of me, then that means I exist. I belong somewhere." He straightened his small shoulders. "Let them see me. I'll be just another hungry child who found his way to your door. It happens often enough these days." The door rattled under Samuel's increasingly frantic knocking. "Mela, I'm coming in." She heard his key, Thomas had given him 1 year ago for emergencies, scraping in the lock. There was no more time for preparation, no chance to rehearse explanations or coordinate stories. The confrontation she'd spent 2 years avoiding was about to explode into her kitchen, with all the subtlety of a dust storm. Samuel burst through the door first, followed by Dr. Matthews with his black bag and stern expression. Sheriff Carver brought up the rear, his hand resting unconsciously on his gun belt as if mysterious child illnesses might require law enforcement intervention. They stopped short at the scene before them, Mela standing calmly in her kitchen, holding a pale but alert Stella, while a strange boy in miniature cowboy clothes stood quietly beside them like he belonged there. "Well," Dr. Matthews said, after a moment of stunned silence, "the child looks considerably better than Samuel's description suggested she would." "Children recover quickly," Mela said carefully, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "The fever broke about an hour ago." Samuel's eyes fixed on Melvin with growing suspicion. "Who's this? I don't know this boy." This was the moment that would determine everything. Whether her impossible family could survive in a world that demanded rational explanations for every anomaly. Mela felt the weight of every lesson she'd learned about courage and love and the necessity of protecting what mattered most, regardless of what others might think. "This is Melvin," she said, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's been staying with us." The lie came easier than she'd expected, backed by the absolute truth of her commitment to the strange, wonderful family they'd chosen to become. Whatever questions followed, whatever suspicions arose, she would face them with the same fierce determination that had allowed her to accept mystery over certainty and love over logic. The final test wasn't about supernatural transformations or impossible choices. It was about having the strength to defend those choices against a world that would never understand them. Samuel's suspicion crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. "Been staying with you? Since when?" His eyes darted between Melvin's too composed face and Stella's suspiciously rapid recovery. "Mela, I've been checking on you near daily since the fever started. There's been no boy here." Dr. Matthews stepped forward, his medical instincts overriding social niceties. "Mrs. Harrison, I need to examine Stella immediately." Samuel described symptoms that suggested— He paused, studying her transformed daughter's serene expression. "Described symptoms that should have been fatal by now." "People recover," Mela said, but even she could hear how weak it sounded. Sheriff Carver's weathered face hardened with the particular skepticism of a man who'd spent 30 years distinguishing between truth and deception. "Ma'am, where exactly did this boy come from? These are hard times, folks. Don't just take in strays without paperwork, without knowing their people." Melvin spoke for the first time, his voice carefully pitched to sound like any 8-year-old might. "My family's gone, sir. The drought took our farm last month." But something in his tone, an edge of ancient patience, made all 3 men stiffen with instinctive unease. Samuel took a step closer, his face flushing with anger born of fear. "That's a lie. I know every family within 50 miles who's lost their place. There's no family missing a boy your age." "Samuel," Mela began. "No." His voice cracked like a whip. "Something's not right here, Mela. First your daughter's dying, then she's miraculously recovered, and now there's a strange boy who shouldn't exist." He pointed an accusing finger at Melvin. "I think this little bastard's been stealing food, maybe making the child sicker to cover his tracks." The accusation hit Mela like a physical blow. To hear Melvin, who had saved them, who had sacrificed everything to help Stella, called a thief and blamed for her suffering, ignited something volcanic in her chest. This was the confrontation she'd feared, but not as she'd expected it. The battle wasn't against supernatural forces or impossible choices. It was against the terrible human need to transform mystery into something manageable, even if it meant destroying innocence in the process. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice carrying a fury that surprised everyone in the room. "Don't you dare come into my home and accuse a child of—" "Then explain him," Samuel shouted. "Explain how a dying girl suddenly recovers. Explain how this boy appears from nowhere, his face twisted with something that might have been grief. Mela, you're not thinking straight. The isolation, the worry, it's affecting your judgment." Dr. Matthews had been watching Stella with professional intensity, and now his expression grew troubled. "Mrs. Harrison, may I?" He reached toward Stella with gentle hands, but when he touched her wrist to check her pulse, he jerked back as if burned. "Good Lord," he whispered. "Her skin, it's cold as winter water, but she shows no signs of distress." His medical certainty began cracking. This doesn't follow any pattern I've seen in 40 years of practice." Sheriff Carver's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain what's happening here. We've got reports of a dying child, a mysterious recovery, and a boy who doesn't exist in any records." His voice dropped to the tone he used for interrogations. "And if there's been a kind of unnatural interference, well, that's something the county needs to know about." Mela realized with crystalline clarity that this was the moment everything could shatter. These men, good men who thought they were protecting her, would tear apart her transformed family in their determination to impose rational explanations on an irrational miracle. They would separate her from Stella, take Melvin away for questioning he couldn't survive, and destroy the beautiful, impossible thing they'd built together. "The only unnatural thing here," she said, moving to stand between the men and her children, "is 3 grown adults terrorizing children who've done nothing wrong." Her voice rose with each word, carrying 2 years of suppressed grief and newfound fierce protectiveness. "My daughter was sick, and she's getting better. This boy needed help, and I gave it to him. If that threatens your understanding of how the world should work, then maybe your understanding needs changing." Samuel's face went white with anger, and something that looked like betrayal. "Mela, listen to yourself. You're defending something that makes no sense, protecting a story full of holes big enough to drive cattle through." "I'm protecting my family," she said with absolute finality. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Behind her, she felt Stella and Melvin move closer together, drawing strength from her defiance even as the forces of conventional wisdom gathered to tear them apart. The confrontation had arrived not as a single climactic moment, but as a choice that demanded everything she'd learned about courage, love, and the terrible price of protecting what mattered most. The silence stretched taut as a wire fence in a windstorm, ready to snap. Mela could feel the weight of 3 men's certainty pressing against her declaration, could see in their faces the exact moment when protection would transform into force. Sheriff Carver's hand had stopped its drift toward his weapon, but his stance remained that of a man preparing for action. "Family?" Samuel's voice cracked with disbelief and something deeper, the pain of a man who'd thought he understood the woman before him. "Mela, Thomas was my best friend. I promised him I'd look after you and Stella. I can't do that if you won't let me help you see reason." The invocation of her dead husband's name hit like a slap, but it also crystallized something fierce and unbreakable in Mela's chest. Thomas would have understood. Thomas, who'd found her crying over a dying sparrow when she was 16 and helped her nurse it back to health even when everyone said it was foolish. Thomas, who'd believed love could work miracles if you were brave enough to tend it properly. "You want to honor Thomas?" she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of grief transformed into purpose. "Then honor his belief that some things matter more than what makes sense to other people." Dr. Matthews stepped forward, his medical bag clutched like a shield against the inexplicable. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand you're protective of these children, but as the only doctor in 50 miles, I have a responsibility. If there's illness here, if there's been some kind of contamination." "The only contamination," Mela said, "is the assumption that everything mysterious must be dangerous." But even as she spoke, she could see the futility of words against the granite certainty of men who'd decided she was either deceived or deranged. They would not leave. They would not accept her refusal to explain. And each passing moment made it clearer that they were preparing to remove her children from her care, one way or another. Sheriff Carver cleared his throat with official authority. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist you come into town with us. All 3 of you. There are questions that need answering in a proper setting." "No." The word came out harder than stone. "It's not a request." Behind her, Mela felt Stella's small hand slip into hers, fingers cold as starlight but steady as bedrock. "Mama," her daughter whispered, "they can't understand. They'll try to fix what isn't broken." And that's when Mela realized the true nature of the sacrifice demanded. Victory wasn't about keeping her family together at any cost. It was about understanding that love sometimes required letting go of the life you'd fought so hard to build. These men would never stop. There would be more questions, more examinations, more attempts to rationalize the miracle of her transformed daughter and mysterious son. Staying meant endless hiding, constant fear, the slow destruction of everything beautiful they'd created. But leaving meant abandoning the farm that held every memory of Thomas, the land that had been home for 15 years, the community that had sustained her through grief and drought. It meant walking away from Samuel's well-intentioned protection, Dr. Matthews' familiar care, the solid certainty of the only world she'd ever known. "Mama?" Stella's whisper carried new understanding, as if she could see the terrible calculation forming in her mother's mind. Mela closed her eyes and felt the last of her old life crumble away like dust in a killing wind. She had fought for 2 years to hold onto Thomas's farm, to maintain his dreams, to keep Stella rooted in familiar soil. But roots could strangle as easily as nourish, and sometimes love meant choosing to become something unrecognizable in order to protect what mattered most. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Samuel, letting him see the finality of her decision. "You're right. I can't explain what you've seen here today, but I can tell you that my children are safe, healthy, and loved, and I will not let anyone take them from me or subject them to examinations and questioning because their existence troubles your sense of how the world should work." Samuel's face went pale. "Mela, what are you saying?" She turned to gather Stella into her arms, noting how her daughter felt both solid and ethereal, entirely present yet somehow untethered from earthbound limitations. Melvin stepped closer, his ancient eyes reflecting understanding and gratitude that no 8-year-old should possess. "I'm saying," Mela said, hefting the small satchel that held their few essential possessions, "that some families are meant to wander. Some stories can't be lived in the same place where they began." The sacrifice wasn't dramatic or violent. It was the quiet devastation of walking away from everything that had once defined her, choosing mystery over certainty, the unknown over the unbearable safety of a world that would never let them rest. As Sheriff Carver lunged forward and Samuel shouted her name, Mela Harrison stepped through her kitchen door into whatever lay beyond, her impossible family finally, truly free. The world beyond the kitchen door wasn't the familiar yard where Thomas had once taught Stella to catch fireflies. It was something else entirely, a place where the oppressive heat of the drought lifted like a discarded blanket, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibilities that had nothing to do with dust storms or dying crops. Mela's feet touched ground that felt solid yet somehow more forgiving than the hard-pan earth of Bitter Creek. Behind them, she could hear the men's voices, Samuel calling her name with desperate confusion, Sheriff Carver barking orders, Dr. Matthews muttering about medical impossibilities. But their words seemed to come from across a great distance, as if the simple act of stepping through that doorway had placed her family beyond the reach of conventional authority. "Where are we?" Stella asked, her voice carrying wonder instead of fear. Mela looked around and realized she couldn't answer. They stood in what appeared to be the same Texas landscape, rolling hills dotted with scrub oak, the familiar sweep of horizon under an endless sky. But the colors were different, more vivid somehow, as if someone had washed decades of dust from the very air. And there was green here, impossible green, grass that grew thick and lush despite the drought that had ravaged every farm for 3 counties. "We're wherever we need to be," Melvin said quietly, his ancient eyes reflecting satisfaction at a long-sought homecoming. "This is the place between places, where families like ours can exist without explaining ourselves to anyone." The sound of pursuit had faded completely now, though Mela wasn't sure if that meant the men had stopped following or simply couldn't follow where they'd gone. The distinction seemed less important than the profound sense of relief settling into her bones, the relief of a woman who'd finally stopped running from an impossible situation and instead embraced its impossibility completely. Stella released her mother's hand and took a few experimental steps, her movements carrying that same ethereal quality Mela had noticed in the kitchen. "I can feel him here," she said with quiet joy. "Papa, not like before when I was sick and everything was confusing. I can feel him properly now." And Mela could too. Thomas's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder, his approval of the choice she'd made evident in every breath of sweet, clean air. He had always believed love was stronger than convention, had always chosen compassion over comfort. He would have understood why she'd walked away from everything they'd built together in order to protect the family they'd somehow managed to complete. "Was it hard?" she asked Melvin, settling onto the soft grass beside him. "Leaving your first family? Giving up everything familiar?" He considered the question with the gravity of someone who'd spent 53 years learning the difference between sacrifice and surrender. "At first, yes. I was angry for a long time about dying so young, about leaving my parents to grieve." His small face carried shadows of that ancient pain. But staying angry would have meant staying trapped. Some prices are worth paying if they lead to something better. Stella wandered back to them, her arms full of wildflowers that shouldn't have existed in drought-killed Texas. "The hungry feeling is completely gone now," she said, settling between her mother and brother with the contentment of a child who'd finally found her proper place in the world. Not just the need for food, all of it. The emptiness, the fear, the sadness that made everything hurt. Mela wrapped her arms around both children, marveling at how right this felt despite violating every law of nature she'd been raised to respect. "I thought I was saving you," she said, "but I think you were saving me." "Maybe," Melvin said. "We were all saving each other." The sun was setting now, painting the impossible sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise endless tomorrows. Somewhere in the mundane world they'd left behind, Samuel was probably searching the empty farmhouse for clues to their disappearance. Dr. Matthews would file a report about medical anomalies that made no scientific sense. Sheriff Carver would add their names to a list of people who'd simply vanished during the hard years of drought and desperation. They would become another mystery, another story whispered around dinner tables about the strange things that happened when the world grew too harsh for ordinary solutions, and perhaps someday another desperate family would find themselves at a moment of impossible choice and remember that some kinds of love were strong enough to open doors to places where miracles were simply another word for home. "What happens now?" Mela asked, though for the first time in years the uncertainty didn't frighten her. "Now," Stella said, leaning against her mother's shoulder with perfect trust, "we get to find out what comes next." In the growing twilight of their impossible refuge, Mela Harrison held her transformed children close and discovered that freedom tasted exactly like the absence of fear. The morning came differently here, wherever here was. Instead of the harsh glare of drought-baked Texas sun, light filtered through what seemed like perpetual golden hour, warm and forgiving. Mela woke to find Stella and Melvin already awake, sitting together in the soft grass, engaged in the kind of quiet conversation that suggested they'd been talking for hours. "How long were we asleep?" she asked, though time felt negotiable in this place, subject to different rules than the relentless march of minutes that had governed her old life. "Long enough," Melvin said, and she understood he meant long enough to heal, long enough to let the last echoes of their former existence settle into memory rather than urgency. But as Mela stretched and looked around at the impossible meadow where they'd made their refuge, she felt something tugging at her consciousness, not quite regret, but a sense of unfinished business. Samuel's stricken face haunted her, the way he'd called her name as she'd stepped through that doorway. Dr. Matthews, for all his medical limitations, had genuinely cared about Stella's welfare. Even Sheriff Carver had been trying to protect what he understood as community order. "I keep thinking about them," she admitted. "The people we left behind. They must be so confused, so worried." Stella looked up from weaving wildflowers into chains. "Do you want to go back?" The question should have terrified her. After what they'd discovered about themselves, about the nature of their transformed existence, returning to Bitter Creek seemed impossible. But as she considered it, Mela realized that the woman who might return wouldn't be the same desperate widow who'd fled through her kitchen door. She'd crossed a threshold, learned something fundamental about the flexibility of reality when love demanded it. That knowledge had changed her in ways that went deeper than circumstances. "Not to stay," she said slowly, "but maybe there's a way to help them understand, to ease the fear we left them with." Melvin nodded with the approval of someone who'd spent decades learning that true freedom included the choice to return. "The door works both ways, and we're not the same people who left. We can't be hurt by their disbelief anymore." They prepared to return like travelers packing for a journey to a foreign country, carefully, aware that they'd need to translate themselves into a language the ordinary world could accept. But the fear was gone, replaced by something that felt like compassion for people trapped in a narrower understanding of what was possible. When they stepped back through the kitchen door, the farmhouse felt smaller somehow, as if Mela's expanded understanding of reality had made the familiar walls contract. Samuel sat at her kitchen table, his head in his hands, looking like a man who'd aged years overnight. Dr. Matthews dozed in Thomas's old chair, his medical bag clutched protectively in his lap. Sheriff Carver was nowhere to be seen. Samuel's head snapped up as they entered, his face cycling through disbelief, relief, and something approaching wonder. "Mela. Good God, where did you—" "We searched everywhere, called in help from 3 counties. We went where we needed to go," she said gently, and he could hear in her voice that she was both exactly the woman he'd known and someone entirely new. "We came back because we didn't want to leave you afraid." Dr. Matthews stirred awake, blinking owlishly at the impossible sight of their return. "But you vanished. Completely. We searched every inch—" "Some searches," Mela said, settling into her own kitchen chair with the confidence of someone who'd learned her home could be anywhere she chose to make it, require looking in directions you haven't learned yet. She told them what she could, about love that transcended ordinary limitations, about children who existed in the spaces between conventional understanding, about families that were formed by need rather than biology. She spoke carefully, aware that she was offering them a choice between expanding their worldview or dismissing her as someone broken by grief and desperation. Samuel listened with the intensity of a man trying to bridge the gap between the woman he'd thought he knew and the serene stranger who'd replaced her. "And you're all right, all 3 of you?" "We're more than all right," Stella said, her voice carrying new confidence. "We're exactly who we're supposed to be." The men left eventually, carrying a story they'd spent years trying to understand. But they left peacefully, their fears eased by seeing the Harrison family settled and content, even if the nature of that contentment exceeded their comprehension. As evening fell, Mela found herself standing in her kitchen doorway, no longer a barrier between worlds, but a reminder that all boundaries were ultimately permeable for those brave enough to test them. "Will we stay?" Stella asked. Mela smiled, understanding finally that home was not a place but a state of being, not something you found but something you carried, for now, until we're needed somewhere else. In the growing darkness of familiar Texas night, the Harrison family had returned, changed, healed, and finally free. The new beginning. 3 months later, Mela Harrison stood in the same kitchen doorway, but everything had changed. The drought had finally broken 2 weeks after their return, as if their crossing between worlds had somehow shifted the natural order just enough to allow rain. Now green shoots pushed through soil that had been barren for years, and the sound of water dripping from the eaves had become a gentle percussion accompanying their daily routines. Stella sat at the kitchen table, helping a neighbor woman named Beth understand why her own daughter had stopped eating. Mela watched her 7-year-old speak with quiet authority about grief and healing, offering insights that no child should possess, but that this child wielded with perfect grace. The woman listened with the desperate attention of someone drowning who'd suddenly been thrown a rope. "Sometimes," Stella was saying, "when people hurt too much, they try to make themselves smaller. Like, maybe, if they take up less space, the pain won't find them as easily." Beth nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. Her husband had died in a mining accident the previous month, leaving her with 3 children and debts that seemed insurmountable. Her youngest, barely 5 years old, had grown silent and refused most meals, a familiar echo of Stella's own journey through loss. "But making yourself smaller doesn't make the hurt go away," Stella continued, reaching across the table to touch the woman's work-roughened hand. "It just makes you too weak to carry it properly. The hurt has to go somewhere, either out through tears and talking or into something beautiful." Melvin appeared in the doorway, returning from his afternoon wandering through town. This had become his routine, moving through Bitter Creek like a small ambassador of comfort, appearing wherever someone needed exactly the kind of hope an 8-year-old cowboy could provide. He set a basket of fresh bread on the counter, baked by Mrs. Henley, whose arthritis had mysteriously improved after Melvin spent an afternoon helping her tend her struggling garden. "Clara's eating again," he reported quietly to Mela. "Her mama says she asked for seconds at dinner yesterday." Mela nodded, unsurprised. Word had spread quietly through the community about the Harrison family's gift for helping children through dark passages. Not the supernatural truth of their transformation, that remained their secret, but something more acceptable, that grief had taught them wisdom, that their own healing had shown them how to guide others through similar territories. Samuel knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit he'd developed since their return. His relationship with Mela had shifted into something neither of them quite knew how to name, deeper than friendship, but based on acceptance rather than conventional romance. He understood now that she belonged partially to another realm, that loving her meant accepting mystery as part of the bargain. "Dr. Matthews wants to document what you're doing," he said, settling into Thomas's chair with the easy familiarity of someone who'd earned his place at their table. "Says he's never seen anything like the recovery rates among the children you've helped." "Let him document what he can understand," Mela said, bringing him coffee without being asked. "Sometimes the most important healing happens in the spaces between what can be measured." Beth gathered herself to leave, pressing a small payment into Stella's palm despite the child's protests. "You tell your mama what I told you about Lucy," she said, "about the eating." After she left, Stella turned to her family with the satisfied expression of someone who'd completed important work. "She's going to be all right, her and all 3 children. I could feel it, like when a fever breaks." The evening settled around them with the comfortable rhythm they'd established since their return. Melvin helped Mela prepare dinner while Stella worked on her reading, slowly catching up to where a 7-year-old should be after months of illness had interrupted her education. But her learning carried an otherworldly quality, as if she were remembering rather than discovering new information. After the dishes were clean and the house settled into twilight quiet, Mela found herself once again in the kitchen doorway. Samuel had gone home, the children were reading together by lamplight, and the night sounds included the blessed whisper of wind through leaves that had grown back green and full. Thomas's presence felt different now, not the desperate, clinging connection she maintained during the worst of her grief, but something gentle and approving. He understood what their family had become, how love had transformed them into something that could exist in multiple worlds simultaneously. A wagon approached down the dusty road, carrying another family, drawn by stories of the woman who could help children find their way back from the dark places grief created. Mela recognized the particular way they traveled, urgent but hesitant, hope warring with desperation. "Mama," Stella called softly from inside. "Someone's coming who needs us." Mela smiled, understanding that this was their new beginning, not an ending tied up neat and final, but a transformation that would continue to unfold. They had learned to exist between worlds, to offer healing to those brave enough to accept help that couldn't be fully explained. As she walked toward the approaching wagon, Mela Harrison carried with her the profound peace of someone who had finally discovered her family's true purpose: to prove that love could work miracles, one impossible healing at a time.